Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. Another beautiful sunny day in Aberdeen. It wasn't so this morning. My name is Nuno Sacramento. I'm the director and curator of Peacock and the Worm up in Aberdeen. And we've got the incredible pleasure to have worked for the best part of 9 months with a group of women who were in and around Aberdeen in the 70s and 80s. And the result of that collaboration between Peacock, this group, and the university is the exhibition in the adjacent room here called Dreams and Dangerous Ideas, 2 decades of women's liberation movement in Aberdeen. So today is our second webinar on the exhibition, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce 2 of the speakers for this afternoon. I'll be very quick introducing them, and then I'll give the word to Chris Alderett, who I've introduced last week, who will be chairing the session. So Margaret Lochley, formerly Margaret Marshall, was a founder member of Aberdeen People's Press with others, finding and learning to operate the printing press, writing and commissioning articles and pamphlets, and selling the fortnightly newspaper in pubs and other venues. She was an active member of Aberdeen's liberation in the early 70s and helped to develop the first women's studies course for the Workers' Educational Association, the WEA. She later became district secretary of the WEA, North of Scotland, providing training for shop stewards, return to study courses for women, adult literacy, and community education. In the mid-1980s, she moved to London, where she was for many years chief exec of the Preschool Learning Alliance. In 2001, she received a honorary degree from the Open University for her work tackling educational disadvantage. In 2004, with a small group of others, she established a new organization named Capacity, which published research and evaluations and undertook training focusing on poverty, rural disadvantage, the work of children's centers and family education. And Margaret was one of the forces behind the exhibition Another World is Possible on the Aberdeen People's Press here in Aberdeen. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Sandy Wiles as well, who was active in the 70s and 80s women's liberation movement and also the gay movement. A founding member of the Women's Action Group, she was involved in the development of girls' work throughout the city. She participated in campaigns, including National Abortion Campaign, Reclaim the Night, and played in the Real Aliens, Mabel Meldrums, and feminist bands, the Screaming Harpies and the Fabulamas. And we have a video of the Fabulamas here in the exhibition, should you have the opportunity to come and visit. Without further ado, I will pass on to Chris Alderett.
Thank you, Nuno. Many thanks to Peacock Gallery and Worm for all the help that they've given to us in creating this exhibition. So many thanks again. You were thanked last week, but the thanks bear repeating. Today's webinar will look at the emergence of women's studies courses and the development of educational opportunities for women and girls. In the 1970s, girls and women underachieved at school and were underrepresented in higher education, apprenticeships, and technical education. The view that it wasn't worth educating women meant that subjects for girls led them to low-paid or domestic work in the main. Women's Studies was born from the Women's Liberation Campaign's groups and workshops. It included learning about women's history, art, writing, and science, but also provided practical self-help in the form of self-defense courses, women's rights, and opportunities for women courses, together with crèche provision. And the crèche provision was really a crucial part of that. By the 1970s, in the middle of the 1970s, a new type of youth work emerged, work with girls and young women, which was led by feminists who saw opportunities to help young women and to support them to develop their interests and aspirations. Up to that point, youth work, which was part of community education, was chiefly about boys. You were much more likely to find a pool table in a youth setting. Sandy and Margaret will reflect on the work, Margaret on the women's studies, women's education area, and Sandy on girls' work. The work was seen as subversive and a threat to the established order by many. They'll assess what was achieved and also what was subsequently lost in the advent of Thatcherism. And maybe I can just say one thing about housekeeping as well, that please will you, if you wish to ask a question, ask the question in the chat function, rather than in not in the chat function, in the question and answer function, rather than the chat. That would be very helpful. And I'll hand over to Margaret for the first section of the talk, which will be about women's studies and women's education. I should actually say the title of the talk again, which is Dreams and Dangerous Ideas, our generic title for the exhibition, and Women Breaking the Silence.
Thank you, Chris. And can I, before we start, also thank Nuno, Neil and Angie for the fantastic work they've done in holding this exhibition. I know very much that Nuno himself would like to think that another world was possible, which was the title of the APP one. And, you know, incredibly generously, they've given their time to make this happen. So thanks, everybody. Anyway, I'm now going to try and share my screen. And it actually works, yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, look. Equal pay is now enough.
I think something for media again, which we might do.
I first became aware of the women's movement shortly after Alan and I had come to Aberdeen, and we were involved with people trying to set up the Aberdeen People's Press. And in my opinion, I think the women's movement is probably the most influential political movement of the 20th century. And we may not have reached the moon yet, but we have made some progress towards it. And I chose that caption, equal pay is not enough, we want the moon. And you can just see it in the photograph. And that came from a placard carried by a very young Sheila Rowbotham, who was a socialist feminist very much at the heart of this, during a demonstration. And I think the point is that although the initial demands, the first 4 demands of the women's movement were about rights, the right to equal pay, equal opportunities, childcare, and the right to control our bodies, it was actually much broader than that. And even by 1970, before 1970, there were women's groups in most towns and cities in the UK. And when the first conference took place in 1970, at which these demands were agreed, those local groups could field 600 delegates to a conference to agree a way forward. And yes, it was about rights, but it was also about a call for change, a very profound change in the way that women live their lives, and in the power relations that existed and kept women back in so many ways. It was really a call for revolution in the way we lived after living that way for hundreds, thousands of years. And it was a bit, in my mind, as if women had been living in a flat world, had believed it was a flat world, and it had been that way for so long that it was completely liberating to step out of that flat world and to believe that change was possible. And just to take you back a little bit to the 1970s, I dare say there are quite a few people here who can remember it, but perhaps not everybody. Chris spoke last week very comprehensively about the lack of equality in pay grades and discrimination against women, particularly at work. But really, women were more or less treated as the property of men. They couldn't raise bank loans or mortgages without their husbands' say-so. And it was quite normal practice at that moment, when income tax returns were received by married women, that they would have the words that said, if you're a married woman, this form should be given to your husband and treated as if it was addressed to him. Women were left behind in education. Girls did well until they got to the teens and then fall behind. Women were way behind in terms of the numbers who went on to higher education and were virtually excluded from vocational education and apprenticeships. The marriage bar that compelled women to give up their jobs if they married was not finally abolished until the 1980s. And I can certainly remember as a schoolgirl that most of the female teachers were misses rather than married women, because that was the only way that they could continue to follow a profession. Men-only clubs and pubs shut women out, and it was to be some time before the Sex Discrimination Act put paid to that. Women were a very small voice in Parliament. Women were were vulnerable to the people nearest to them in their families, their husbands and partners. Rape and domestic violence were not considered crimes. And perhaps worst of all, women were subjected to all kinds of procedures in the name of illness, when a lot of the time they were simply rebelling. I remember as a student working in an asylum for my holidays, where there were women in the 60s and 70s who'd spent their entire life in a mental institution, basically because of what was considered bad behavior. They'd got pregnant while unmarried, or they had been rebellious. And hysteria as a diagnosis was not actually abolished until 1980. So if the rest of the slide hopefully shows, women were then, as they are now, objectified and sexualized, and that was reflected in some highly sexist adverts of the time. So one of the interesting things about hindsight is looking back, and it makes me think now that, you know, the scale of trying to change all of this is enormous, huge, and yet we just set about it as women did by doing one thing at a time, and maybe on the maxim of if you want to eat an elephant, then the way to do it is one spoonful at a time. There was no social media, there was no email, there was no internet. People communicated with each other by post, through telephone, in groups and through meetings. But somehow this ripple effect grew and grew, and hundreds and thousands of women were involved in trying to change things. But it wasn't easy, simply because that state had existed for so long. There was no map of how to get there. Maybe if we were doing it now, you would have to have a business plan and smart objectives. But the reality of life for us was people got involved, became galvanized by very small acts of protest or resistance, like Sandy Hay on her assault on a beauty competition in Aberdeen, or on men-only bars. And that in turn led to talking about things, meeting with other women, forging friendships, and, as I say, taking small steps towards trying to change things. And women's studies was an inevitable part of that for a number of reasons. You know, a very main one was just the weight of myth. Women's lives at that time and in the years before were justified and rationalized by cultural myths, scientific myths. Women's brains were smaller than men's, and therefore they weren't as intelligent, that they were less strong physically, that they were too emotionally vulnerable, too governed by their gender, their childbearing part of them, to take part in the world, that there were no truly great women artists, no truly great women writers. So women's studies grew up really to try and burrow under that weight of myth. And it became a body of research that looked through all kinds of disciplines, putting women at the center and trying to establish our own truths. And saying that makes it sound like it was incredibly well organized and directed, and actually it wasn't. You know, the entire operation, as I remember, of the women's movement was that there was no overall direction. There was no head office. People largely operated on a local basis, and yes, came together for campaigns, for things like the National Abortion Campaign, very effectively. But we all tried to find our way where we were with the people we knew. And here in Aberdeen, we began in a small way with some courses that began roughly around the middle of the 1970s. And those grew out of consciousness raising groups, discussion groups, where women talked about how some of the stereotypes that were perpetuated about women, you know, how we held them in ourselves. We talked about how we could help each other to try and forge a different way. And somehow those groups just led naturally onto the idea of some courses. Of course, there was nobody there that was obvious to run some of those courses. I remember Chris and I talking at the time about, could we find somebody to teach a women in history course? And we couldn't think of anyone, so we just set about researching it ourselves. And that was pretty much true for all those other early courses that are listed there. I was involved in a women's psychology course, and it struck me very profoundly that I'd spent 4 years studying psychology at university. I had never learned while I was there how vulnerable women were to mental illness, and how particularly women were singled out in many of the treatments that were given to them. So we began through our own research. On those courses, we were joined by women, I think, who already had an interest in the women's liberation movement. And many of them went on to become tutors themselves. When the Women in History course came to an end, the group continued to meet and develop materials that others could use, people who weren't necessarily in that original grouping. And towards the end of that period, those same women, we formed a branch of the WA. I mean, I feel there isn't the time, we've got a lot to go through, but the WA was a natural organization for us. The WA as an organization existed as a social movement as well as an educational movement. Its raison d'etre was about education to achieve particular social ends. So it was a very good partner for us, and I think we were good for the WA. So as we came towards the end of the 1970s, and there was quite a vibrant program going, I guess our thoughts turned more to, you know, the area of women's studies or education was actually a practical help to women to make changes in their own lives. Bearing in mind that lots of women hadn't achieved their full potential because when they'd been at school, they had been influenced to go in for easier subjects or subjects that weren't as likely to lead them to well-paid work. We were influenced in our thinking about the number of women with young children and loving those children and feeling satisfied as mothers, but still isolated. And needing the support of other women. So the courses are listed here. Daytime discussion groups, which were initially for mother and toddler groups in Aberdeen and in the rural hinterland and beyond, sprung up. These were free to women. There was a crèche, which had been established using funding from Manpower Services Commission, which existed at that time, and enabled us to offer education that was in a place where people lived, at a time when they could come, where there was an opportunity for the children to be looked after. And it was very much a joint effort with those who attended. What kinds of things were discussed, quite often mothering, issues to do with children, people's feelings, very much student-centered around what people wanted themselves. We then went on to investigate, and after a lot of research, developed one of the first new opportunities for women courses, which were intensive, equivalent to about a day a week, again with childcare, a big study element involved, and also slightly geared to helping women to decide if they come to a stage where they're thinking about returning to work, how they might get from where they were to where they wanted to be, but again, built around their own experiences. This work also went on elsewhere in the WA. The north of Scotland was very much at the start of that. It happened throughout the WA, and there was a very strong women's studies element from the very north of Scotland down to the south coast. Carry-on learning courses were, again, similar to new opportunities for women, but where women had younger children, weren't yet ready to go back to work. And those took place in community centres in and around Aberdeen and in the area surrounding, again with crèches, big emphasis on study skills, on English communication skills, on topics that were of interest to women, topics of the day. The group I was involved with went on to write and perform a play about the dilemma that women have when they get pregnant and don't want to be. Other groups did loads of creative writing that was published by the WA, and really it was an incredibly creative period. I don't want to say too much because Connie is going to say something about her experience of being on those courses, but by 1983, there was a very large program of work that would be, it's unrecognizably changed today, and it was unrecognizably changed from 10 years before. And it was based on the principles I mentioned. It took place when women could attend. I spent most of my career in adult education, where people talked endlessly about the hard to reach, when if they only stopped to think about it, they would have realized it is not people that are hard to reach, it is provision, education, which isn't fitted around the needs of the people who use it. Where there was crèche provision, you simply cannot have second chance education for women unless there's a crèche where that's needed. And maybe most important of all, throughout everything that we did, whether it was basic education, return to study, new opportunities, women's studies courses, it was about validating the experience of women themselves. Women had spent so long being told they were wrong. And that's not to say we don't get things wrong, but they were told that things were wrong because they were women. So if they felt unhappy about being in a situation where they were at risk of violence, if they felt unhappy about having to give up work when they married, somehow they were made to feel wrong. And I think the thing that seems to me most important achievement of that time was that women's voices were heard. Anyway, I'm going to ask Connie to come in now, if she's ready.
Yes. Okay. And yet, let me see. How do I come in? Hang. Oh,
They will let you in.
Have I come in?
We can hear you, Connie, yeah?
Can you hear me? All right. Okay, you can hear me. That's fine. Can you see me? No.
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, hi, Margaret. Thanks for inviting me to talk about my experiences of the new opportunities for women's course. How did I discover the WA? Well, first of all, let me roll back the years. I was the mother of a toddler and 2 teenage girls. The girls were at the academy and I had given up my job to have my son. I was a shop assistant at Norco House. I loved my job and I really missed my colleagues who had also become friends, and I felt a bit stuck being at home with a small child. Just by chance, I bumped into a friend who was carrying a bundle of leaflets, and that was Frances O'Boyle, who I later discovered had been the chair of the WA District Committee. And she told me all about this new course for women and shoved a leaflet in my hand. When I did eventually get round to reading the leaflet, it described this new opportunities for women's course. It said it was offering a range of different learning experience, required no formal qualifications, very important to me, no exams, and a definite plus in my case. And I would like to say that this had me rushing off to sign up, but no, I have to say, what it did say to me in Neon Lights, that there was a free crèche. That was so important to me. I don't want to go on, so I'm just trying to work out what I jotted down a few things. I'm sorry about it.
Thank you, Connie. I wonder if there's if you want to have a chance to bring those other things in later in the session, and we can move on to Sandy.
No, but the final thing that I would like to say though is with my involvement with the WA, it opened great doors for me, and I had, ended up having a great love of literature. I ended up going on to further education, which enhanced my and my family's prospect in monetary terms. And it also started off my political interests, and involvements in a political party. And I do owe this all to the WA, and I owe it to yourself, Chris, Margaret Marshall, as I knew you, Margaret Marshall, Margaret Lockery, Sheila Doonan, and God bless them, Alan Ray, to name quite a lot of women. They were very supportive, but that's just the main thing I wanted to get over. Okay.
There may be questions for you, just as there may be questions for the other two speakers at the end of the session. But I'll move on to Sandy now for a description of what girls' work was like at the time and what it meant to us. Thanks, Sandy.
Right, thanks. Well, carrying on actually from what Margaret was saying, I was actually a young member of the women's history class at the WEA. I was fresh up from Stirling, and myself and a friend were quite keen to get involved in a lot of the political activity that was going on. And I mean, that group was fantastic because it really did open my eyes to the women that had come before. And I got involved in a lot of campaign work in Aberdeen, but I was also doing a postgrad in youth and community work. And at the end of that, I was 22. I was eager to get out into the world of work. And I'd applied for a job at the 62 Club, which to locals, has happy memories. It was opened in 1962, and it was in Summer Street. So it was a city centre youth provision. And I had never worked in a youth club before. I had absolutely no experience at all. But what I did have, and what they were keen to exploit or to use, was my background in my political activities. I was involved in Rock Against Racism. I was involved in Rock Against Sexism. Now, being in Aberdeen, it was quite difficult sometimes to feel part of the bigger group of people involved in the music scene. But Aberdeen had a burgeoning music scene at that time, lots of new punk bands emerging, lots of bands coming up. So the scene was kind of set when I hit the 62 Club to, I suppose, be part of that. And there was a traditional youth club there, which, I mean, it was good fun, don't get me wrong. Pool, darts, table tennis, television, a disco unit that could be used, a motorcycle shed outside. But the problem was, it was mainly all boys using it and loving it. And the girls seemed to be quite passive and shadow-like. And I felt, even at 22, I didn't have anything really in common, which was a very odd thing to feel, given that I'd had all this women's rights and keep together, women have lots of things to talk about and we're all here together. And even asking some of the youth workers, there was 11 part-time youth workers. So that tells you the amount of resources that was in city centre provision in the very, very early 80s. I said, the old Freud question, what is it that women want? You know, what is it young girls want? And they really, they just want to be with the boys. That was the answer. I thought, well, surely not. And upstairs, when I went searching up the stairs in the 62, there were lots of like old sewing machines. There were, if you remember the old hairdressers from the 60s, the beehive, you know, the kind of style haircuts and these big hoods that went over. Loads of them all not working. Loads of art materials. And the girls said, oh, we don't want to use these things. These are ancient. And, you know, it was quite difficult to kind of work out what on earth, apart from working in the tuck shop, could we get them engaged in. But parallel to that, there was obviously all these political grassroots movements that had come through the 60s and 70s. And they were still pretty, I would say, pretty important. I mean, I looked at my diary. I actually do collect diaries. Look at that, 1981. And in the no nuclear power, thanks, of course, and the women's symbol. And I look back, you know, and I did keep, like Virginia Woolf, I did keep sort of notes in here. And when I looked for the week, the March, the time about now, what was I doing in 1981 in my work? Well, I had a meeting on youth opportunities. I also had a meeting with the No Deposit Band to discuss a concert, a discussion with the student on glue sniffing, reality attack rehearsal. And I think, Chris, that might even have been a band that you and I were in. So we were and then on the 25th, the Youth Unemployment Union, the meeting with them, the Women's Action Group to look at Screaming Harpies playing for them. Now, how I managed to get that into my work, I do not know. But that was the blurring of our personal politics and community education at that time. We're absolutely delighted to have this new, I suppose, breadth of fresh air through the youth club kind of thing. So I've also got, in March 1981, work to rule, 36.25 hours over 5 days, Nalgo. So I was out on strike. And then I was meeting with Solidarity, Youth Against Missiles. I was at the music hall, of course, for the Misconceived that I played and along with Chris and some of the other women, where we felt that equal opportunities for women was not really being addressed, I must say, by certainly society. I mean, I've got conference on unemployment, I've got play scheme forums. So my work was packed, but still girls were sort of this enigma. I couldn't quite get my head around it. And luckily we had an association of community workers and a lot of the women who'd come through these courses, but not all of them. Not all women were feminists. And you've got to remember it's a movement. It's not you join a club. So my feminism, my kind of experience of being a woman was very different from a woman growing up in a local estate in Powys or Northfield. I grew up in Stirling, between Glasgow and Edinburgh. I got to go to concerts. I was in the Labour Party Young Socialists. I was down in Blackpool. at the conferences. So my experience was, quite different, but I was aware that, we were very aware of this thing about what are we going to do. So we did decide, why don't we start a girls group? Now, it wasn't our original idea. There were groups starting, and I've actually looked out this book, which was quite important. If you, I might be back to front here, but it was called Girls Are Powerful, and it was produced by the Sheba feminist publishers, and it has the wonderful price of 30 pence. That's what you paid for it then. And another one, which was Feminism for Girls. Now, these were London-based, and to be quite honest, I mean, I don't think I've even read them, because they just weren't really our experience. And kind of thought, well, we're just going to have to look at what the girls locally want. So started up a group, and it was a Tuesday night, and it had a worker called Fiona Mitchell, who was fantastic. She worked at the P&G, I think, as a copywriter. And she came in with me, and we basically just put a note round to the girls saying, if you're interested, come along. And we didn't really think we'd get empty. Well, we got about 8 girls coming that first night. And the punk movement was quite important, I think, in helping certain girls to take that leap into, we can do it. We're going to try things. We want to try. We don't want necessarily to go canoeing. We're not interested in all that outdoor stuff. But we want to kind of try new makeup. We want to do some kind of chat about what to do if you're out on the town and you've lost your mates. How do you get home? I mean, it was actually very practical. What happens, if I don't want to leave school? What happens? So we thought these are great questions. So we started a group, myself and Fiona, in the 62 Club. But very quickly, these groups took off throughout the city. We had groups in Powys, Northfield. If anybody knows Aberdeen, these are quite far out of town. It's not just like a wee walk. So each group was allowed to have its own identity and its own agenda and its own kind of setup. So I never really knew what was going on in Northfield. Didn't really know what was going on under Jadon. It was not a controlled agenda. And that's what the girls loved. They loved coming in, chatting. And I did youth work for 40 years, and I can tell you at the end, it was, what were the soft indicators? How many times did the young person give you eye contact? I mean, it really was that. Whereas in our days, in the days of the girls' groups, it was basically come in, and even if you had a discussion organised about drugs or glue sniffing, a girl might come in and say, oh, can't believe it, my sister's pregnant. And people go, oh my goodness. And she says, oh, it's amazing, I'm really happy. On one level, I'm like, what's the other level? She's got me down babysitting and the bairn's not even born, so we talked about this whole thing about girls' roles and how they were expected to help out more than boys, and how often they were expected to be home earlier, and it just, it wasn't fair and things. So we had a lot of that kind of open-ended discussion. And I mean, to be honest, I could go on all night about this, but the male workers, we had reactions, some very positive and some very negative. And you couldn't often predict who would be the negatives. We had a lot of good male support, I must say that. And without that, I think it would have been horrendously difficult. We wanted to get funding for this work. And one of the problems was convincing the head of the kind of outfit that the girls' work would be worth it. Luckily, and I must mention Phil Darcy, he was head of community education, and he was very much for girls' work. And having a kind of champion, and Margaret Smith as well, another person who was on our side, really helped. So I would say, you have to have these champions who are talking to counsellors, talking to people in charge. So the girls' work, it was, as I say, different in every group, but I just want to pick out a couple of things I think that were really interesting. In Powys, particularly, there was a mother and daughter project, which on the surface at the time, some of our girls went, oh, I wouldn't want to do that, because they had removed themselves almost from the family by coming into the city centre. They were a different set sometimes of young women. But the Powys project was really interesting because the girls, I'm calling them girls because obviously they were at that time, aged probably 13 to 15, were starting to rebel. And the kind of thing was, well, do you not know, why don't you talk to your mum about what she did, what music she liked, what clothes she wore, where did she spend her time? And they thought, oh, quite like the sound of that. So they had a little project where they took photographs of themselves in the outfits that they were wearing. And then they found photographs of their mothers from the 60s. it was the beehives, you know, the kind of brilliant coats like Twiggy and fantastic shoes. And they were absolutely shocked, like, my goodness. So that project was brilliant because they did interviews with their mothers as well, and they asked all these questions. And that project, I know that some of the workers in Powys did try to get it into the art gallery, but unfortunately it's a year's wait. And it went up in the 62 Club for our girls' conference day, and I think it was in Powys for some time. So that was a great example of the generations coming together. And, you know, it's not as far apart as often people think. The other thing I would just highlight is when we had our trip to Dundee. Now, the girls, I worked with about 10 girls, I think, regulars. And some of them were saying, oh, why can we not go away? All these boys get to go canoeing and outdoor stuff. We're not interested. And of course, community education was always trying to, it's the old Christian muscular kind of get out there, you'll feel better type attitude. Well, you really need to try and get these girls interested. And I'm saying, well, they really are not interested. Can we not just have the money and decide we want to do something else? So we did. And we actually took them to Dundee. And the idea was we'd go to Dundee for the weekend. It was like, well, why do you want to go to Dundee? Well, it's got Fat Sam's club and it's got shopping centre. And some of the guys laughed, oh, that's ridiculous. But actually we did have that trip, and we used it as the Church of Scotland helped us. And we always found it was the YWCA, it was the Church of Scotland. These groups really came to the rescue when we needed some money, and they didn't put the kind of kibosh on it by putting a circle and saying, you know, we want outcomes. We want you to talk to all the girls and ask them, how did you find it? And the trip was great. We did go to Fat Sam's, and it was quite funny because Fiona was driving. I didn't learn to drive until I was 27, so I still wasn't driving. And we got down to Dundee and parked the van up at the back of Fat Sam's, and we all kind of went in. And the boy, the bouncer guy went, sorry, I'm not letting you in. And I says, what, me? He says, yes, you. And I says, oh, wait a minute, I'm 24, you know. And he says, the Fiona goes, she's 24. And I says, I am. And she goes, and the girls are all at the back. And I'm going, oh my God, if we don't get in, what are we going to do? So he says, no, he says, I need some ID. Have you not got identification? Why would I have that? I mean, obviously, you wouldn't carry your passport about that. I certainly didn't have a driver's license. And he said, well, I don't know if I can let you in, you know. And Fiona's going, oh, please, we've come all the way down from Aberdeen and we really want to enjoy ourselves. And I was like, oh, okay, then on you go. And I thought, well, how are these girls going to get in? Oh, all got fake ID, straight in. And how did that happen? We had a great time. The girls were perfect, I mean, brilliant. No problem, nobody tried to get off at the end of the day. It's nothing. And became, you know, basically had a great time, went shopping. They loved the shopping centre, and it was fantastic. So, and there was no kind of agenda. That was just a fantastic, I don't think you could do that nowadays, actually. You'd have to have all the health and safety and safeguarding and stuff. So, and I just want to, I know time's short here, I just wanted to say that I got back in touch with some of the young women who are now in their 50s. And that was fascinating, because as soon as I picked up the phone, we were right back. It was like time had stood still. But what I wanted to say was, Paula had said, you know, she came from a background that was quite political, and she was involved in, obviously, 62 Club Girls, CND, Unemployment Workers Union, Anti-Apartheid, Rape Crisis, TGWU. But what she said was, I have great memories of that time. I was as chock full of teenage angst as the next person, and I had my personal issues to deal with. But I was allowed to make mistakes, have stupid ideas and say stupid things. And the only people who knew were those at the time, and they eventually forgot. And that's something that, because there's no social media. And there was other girls, Daiso, who put a band together, a Shock Result girls band, would never have happened without the support of the girls group in the 62. And Mo, who said that, I remember, you know, I grew up in Northfield, didn't fit in, and I despised unfairness. And when the girls group started, I remember the guys being a bit miffed and saying that we'd all turn into lesbians because it was just for girls. But personally, I think they were scared we'd be encouraged to be just as good, as if to be as good if not better than them. So I think, you know, I've got stacks of stuff that I'm really keen to pass along, but they were sort of grateful. They said, I'm grateful to these beautiful souls who cared enough about young girls and helped guide us when our parents and teachers couldn't be bothered, as we didn't fit into their pretty picture. And I would just sort of finish on Mo's last thing. I thought that really summed it up. We weren't afraid of dying. We were just afraid of being controlled. And I think that's still today a very powerful message for anybody working with young people. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Sandy. A lovely note to end on. I wonder if I can invite questions. There are a couple of contributions in the chat already, or in the question and answer, I should say. Please feel free to add other questions in the chat. And if you'd like to speak to anything you've already put up there, I can bring you in, I think, or I can ask for you to be brought into the discussion. A comment from Kate. Philip, Kate, do you want to read your comment out, or would you like me to read it out for you? Just 1 second while I see if I can put your microphone on. I think Nuno would need to do that. Kate's, I'll read Kate's question anyway in the meantime, or Kate's comment. The WA courses were excellent, but I think it's also vital to recognise the collaborative nature of these, in particular the role of women in communities and feminist community workers who did first step work in recruitment support and neighbourhood work. Perhaps Margaret, you'd like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think Kate's absolutely right. You know, and if we had more time, we might have been able to unpack that a bit more. It was a very, I mean, the context at the time was, you know, the importance of community education in Scotland. It was a priority, but, you know, it was very much the people working with mother and toddler groups and other groups in the community that made that possible. You know, obviously, as in any group, there were some people who were keener on it than others, and I certainly had 1 or 2 little bumps in the road in different places of Aberdeen, but it doesn't undermine what Kate said at all. It was a real effort, and the very fact that community education was seen valuable, not just for women, but for people, was enormously helpful.
Kate, I have actually switched on your microphone, so if you'd like to say something.
Right, yeah, I think that's really important. And, you know, the fact that there was, the WA was central to building up that kind of groundswell to women in that were working in community education to push the boundaries a bit. And we, you know, Sandy was saying, there's the Association of Community Workers and all sorts of debates and splits there. You know, I remember we were trying to take women down to the Women's Co-op conference, and the room just split down the middle. And it was just, a lot of us were expecting that, but a lot of women weren't expecting it. You know, they thought we were all in it together. And I think the realization about the resistance was as much a learning thing for workers. So the WA keeping the banner going, keeping saying women's studies are important was so important. It was crucial. And I think that way of actually everybody working in together, even if you weren't a feminist, you would see the value of this kind of work in your community centre. And there was a whole educational process going on there, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Anyone else like to respond to that, Sandy or Margaret?
I would just say that, yeah, I mean, because I never covered half of what I wanted to cover, but I think without that support, I don't think it would have happened, because when I went down to Edinburgh, it was the 90s and things had completely changed, and girls' work was had disappeared, to be honest. And it was all education and getting into work and training courses and schemes. And by the end of my career, I was the only person left, I think, probably in my work who was in a union. So things had kind of really disappeared, and we didn't have the support that you need to put your head above the parapet. And I think, you know, having that groundswell of confidence and, yeah, you know, we've got friends and mates, and we've also got companions on the road here. That was absolutely crucial.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, very important.
I wonder if Nancy Ray, who also has put in a message for you, Sandy, saying that she was the coordinator of the first Aberdeen Women's Festival and Young Women in Music Project.
Yeah.
And thanking you for your contribution to this. I wonder if Nancy, you'd like to say anything? I can
Please, Nancy, because I had no time to go into the whole thing about the women's Young Women's Music Project. Just didn't have time.
I think you should be able to speak, Nancy.
Hi, yes, Sandy, hello. I was going to say, one of the things I found amazing, I moved to Aberdeen at 17. I'd left home. My grandmother had been taken into hospital, and I moved to Aberdeen as a 17-year-old with no idea, never lived in the city, living in my grandmother's council house where she'd been taken into hospital, and just sort of, I think, arrived at the Gordon Street Unemployment Project kind of going, right, I'm here. What can we do? And what I found amazing was at that time, the energy and the willingness for people to work together to make things happen. I met Sandy and was involved with various things, the Women's Centre, Young Women in Music Project. I worked in sort of youth work as well, and a lot in Powys and Torry and Kincorth. And then through that, I also worked with Leslie Dunbar, and we got involved with setting up the first Women's Festival, which for me, the politics was really interesting for me because I was a very girly girl who was also gay, but didn't conform to any of the stereotypes, which at the time I found challenging. And it was really interesting to be involved across so many different types of politics at the time. And I remember one of the things I remember the most was when we did the Women's Festival, we did a cabaret club in the evening and we had a mixed audience. All of the performers were women, but we had a mixed audience. And we had a really strong reaction because people felt it should be women only. And I felt very strongly it shouldn't be women only because we were celebrating the talent of women, but that shouldn't be a women only audience. And things like that came up quite a lot, where I think it was just at a change point of politics, of what needed to be for a secured women's space and women only, and when it was about celebrating women and bringing women to the fore. So I suppose I just wanted to, I don't think I could have done what I did at the age I was if it hadn't been in Aberdeen at that time. It was a very, I think that one of the things we've lost now, ironically, I'm sitting in a car park outside a community centre right now when my 13-year-old daughter is in a music club in the Southside Community Centre behind me, where I can hear the drums playing in the background. But at the time, a lot of things happened between some of the amazing women in the city, but also with the support of some of the amazing men in the city. When we did the Young Women in Music Project, and we Graham, who came in and helped us do all the PA stuff and going into the community centres and working with young women. We had Sven, who let us use a recording studio that would have cost thousands of pounds, but he gave it over to us to bring in young women to record their own electronic sounds. I must admit, even now I'm scarred with the No Limits. No, which I think was sampled in every single track. But it was just that thing of the willingness of people to give time, give resources, and allow us to make things happen. It meant that for people like me who wanted to make things happen, it allowed us to actually open doors, which I think would be so much harder now.
Thanks, Nancy. Want to respond any further, Sandy? Or
yeah, I would just say, if I did another hour, Nancy, I would have been talking about the wonderful work that you and Leslie did, which was amazing, because we did get money to do research into why girls drop out of music when they leave school. And, we did the research, and I think you came up with, they really want to play drums, they want to play bass guitars, they want to play keyboards, they don't want to play flutes and violins. And that might have changed now, but certainly then there was these images of girly things. And I think, the work you did really underpinned a lot of the kind of longer term, certainly these young women who came, the Garthadia rappers. I remember us taking them to the Tory Festival, and they'd worked out their dance routines and pedal pushers and kind of Burberry caps, and they had their whole dance routine down, and they were 12, 13 or something. It was amazing, up on the Tory Festival stage, and hand it to you for that one.
I've also picked up on Sheila Doonan, who has said it was great to hear about the wonderful work we did, which I think she was definitely very involved in. Sheila, I don't know if you'd like to speak. I think I've enabled you to do so.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Wow, it's so brilliant to see you all and hear what you've to say. And it just makes me so glad to have been part of all that energy and stuff that we did in the early 80s in Aberdeen. And that whole thing, what you were saying earlier, Margaret, about, I mean, the thing about starting where people are, people's own experience. You know, I'm working with the WA and also the Adult Learning Project in Edinburgh, in Gorgie Dalry. I really learned such a lot about starting where people are and took that into the work that I later did in training and development, in health and social care, in local authorities and voluntary sector, about starting where people are, you know. Well, one of my little mantras that I learned from someone I respected a lot is connection before content, you know. Just the relational thing of education and learning. And yeah, it was really exciting to hats off to you all for doing this, you know, it's brilliant.
Thank you, Sheila. Chris, could I just interject? I can see the clocks ticking away. You know, we're celebrating here today, and there's a lot to celebrate. But so much of that has gone now, and you know, I'm sure others are aware that Antonio Guterres of the United Nations said just a couple of weeks ago that it's going to take 300 years to achieve gender equality. And in fact, it's diverging. And, you know, it's just sad that there is no way to see how that kind of effort can continue. I mean, women are doing their own things these days. But my own feeling is that there is a need, there's a gap there where people come together as we did in a different way, you know, because you can't go back in time, but to work on the issues that face them.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've enabled Mona to speak because Mona has shared a link and I don't quite understand.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, that's just because I sent it by mistake. Well, I mean, I sent it too early. Basically, first of all, thank you for doing this, because it is just, I suppose the main word I think is hopeful. It is just so hopeful, because some of the stuff that you're saying about, you know, the way that things have to be all regimented and all of that, it's just, you know, patriarchy sucking the life out of things, and somehow or other women going along with it in a very unfortunate way, where we've been brainwashed into thinking that that's somehow okay just because it's neat and tidy, whereas 300 years is not very neat or very tidy, you know what I mean? Anyway, so, but I think the relevant thing really I want to say just now is that I've got, it is an advert, but it's also because I thought you might be interested. I've got a show that I do lots of women's shows. I don't really realize I'm doing shows about women. I think I'm doing shows about human beings, but apparently they're women, so that has got a particular category. And so it's just up in your area. The neck of the woods is in New Deer, Colliston and Crathes, a bit further north. I've got a show on the 23rd, 24th and 25th of March, and it's about it's called Bonnie Fechters, and it's songs and stories about women who have stood up for themselves. And I'm putting it in here really because, you know, because we're still doing it, we're still all doing it, and the women who come along and the men who come along, they have their stories to tell about amazing women. And I think for me, some of it is just doing what we always did, is talking to each other, whether it be on webinars, whether it be through songs, and then the formalities, the people who need it all formalized they're the same people who formalized the fact that a man could beat his wife up as long as the stick wasn't wider than the circumference of his thumb. That was formal as well. Do you know what I mean? So I think that it's more the renegade approach without it necessarily looking like renegades, because that would get stopped. So that's basically it. So the neat thing that's the neat shows is just you can get more information about my show. I would imagine you could turn up at the door. But if you know any people that might want to come along, because I do think sometimes women in rural areas, anywhere can be isolated, but in rural areas can be quite isolated, so it can help if they sort of know that there's still stuff going on, you know, and there are people like-minded people who think like them.
I've just had a note in the question and answer that other participants can't see the question and answer thread. It's only the panelists who can see the question and answers. So could you maybe put it into the chat function and maybe...
Yeah, I couldn't get into the chat earlier on, but maybe I can get in now.
Yep, that's fine. Maybe we could ask Nuno to enable that, if that function could be enabled. I've had one further question that I haven't really addressed at all from Sandra MacDonald, asking about the role of the universities and the colleges in what women were doing in communities in the city at that time. I think the key role of the training for community work has already been highlighted, but perhaps someone would like to comment on that.
There was the Universities Action Group. I don't know if there's anyone here today from that.
I was in it, but the action group, Women's Action Group. Yeah, I mean, it was just, we did get the money. We got our £100. We got our £100 to set the group up, and we didn't have any problems. Basically.
Maybe we need to find out the answer and feed that back, Chris. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the universities did, the University Extramural supported an early women's studies course, and the youth and community work course certainly began to have feminist elements under pressure from the students. But I think perhaps I'm going to have to call this to a halt because we're nearly at our hour's time. Okay, yeah. I think most of the questions in the question and answer have been addressed in some way, and my apologies if your question has not been addressed in full. I'd like to just thank everyone who has taken part, Margaret and Sandy particularly for leading their sections, Connie for her contribution from Women's Experience, and all the participants for your really useful questions and discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.